Is not going on in the state capitol. First off, I want to begin certainly acknowledging the thousands of people who are outside protesting, many of whom are from the state of Wisconsin. Many more lately have been coming in from other parts across the country. Certainly acknowledge their right to be heard. But I particularly want to thank the 300,000 plus state and local workers from across Wisconsin who, unlike those here today, didn't skip out on work, showed up for their jobs, did their jobs the way that they have done in the past, and I believe will do in the future, and that is be good professional public servants, and we appreciate the work that they continue to do. Certainly, again, as I mentioned, the folks outside have every right to be heard, but there's 5.5 million people in this state, and certainly the taxpayers of this state have every right to be heard. We're not going to allow for 1 minute the protesters to feel like they can drown out the voices of those millions of taxpayers all across the state of Wisconsin. What we're asking for today and what we continue to be pushing for in this Capitol is bold when it comes to politics. It's a bold political move, but anytime you challenge the status quo, it's going to be bold. But it is a very modest request of our government workers all across the state. When I was traveling around the state, it's something worth repeating because we've been hearing it time and time again from people contacting us. When I was out at manufacturing plants talking to blue-collar workers across the state earlier this week, it reinforced to me that in many of those cases, they're paying anywhere from 25 to 50% of their health care costs. Most of them don't have pensions, and those that have 401ks, many of them have seen that the contributions from their employer has been suspended in the last year or two, I should say, as the economy has made it difficult in order to preserve jobs. That is in contrast to the very modest request we're asking for, which is a 5.8% contribution to the pension system and a 12.6% contribution from state workers for their health care premium. That's half the national average. To the workers I talk to around the state and continue to hear from even today, they think that's a deal they'd love to have. I know when I talk to others in my family, they point out my brother, who's in many ways a typical middle-class family. He and his wife both work. They have 2 kids. And for them, they're paying almost $800 a month for their health care and for the money they set aside in their 401k. What we're asking for is a reasonable piece of balancing this budget. Wisconsin has a $3.6 billion deficit that we face going into the next biennium. We're broke. Like nearly every state across the country, we don't have any more money. We've been broke for years. And in fact, 2 years ago, they kind of delayed the pain by taking $2.2 billion of stimulus money. And instead of using that for one-time costs like infrastructure, the previous governor and legislature used that to plug in a $2.2 billion hole in terms of their Medicaid and school aid deficit. That's part of the reason why we're here today. They failed to make the tough decisions 2 years ago. We're making the tough decisions now, not only to balance our budget and to help our local governments balance their budgets, but to make sure 2, 4, 6, 8 years down the road, our kids and our kids' kids aren't having to deal with these same crises. So we're here today because we were elected to make tough decisions. I was elected. I interviewed for this job over the last 2 years and told the voters what I would do to get Wisconsin working again, to show that Wisconsin was open for business. We made bold changes in the first month in terms of turning the business climate around to make it easier for private sector employers to put more people to work by easing the burden on taxes, litigation, regulation, and the cost of health care. Now, the next great quest for us to get Wisconsin working again is to balance our budget and to do it in a way that is prudent for the future, not only for the state, but ultimately so that local governments can have those same tools. And that's really what's at the heart of what we're talking about today. I've heard, and I want to clarify some facts, I've now heard after several days in that some union leaders at the state level, the same unions who tried to cram through a series of employee contracts in December, who had, after the election, before I was sworn in, who had no interest in talking to us then about negotiating, but wanted to get that pushed through while they still had the previous majority in place. Unfortunately for the taxpayers of the state, they failed to do so. Now suddenly are talking about being interested in negotiating. Again, we don't have any money. We can't make a good faith effort to negotiate when we don't have any money. But more important than the fact that at the state level, in the past decade, the average amount of time for a contract negotiation has taken 15 months. The reality here beyond that is for our local governments, and I used to be a local county executive, for our local governments, I know this well firsthand, we can't expect for our 72 counties, for our 424 school districts, and for more than 1,000 municipal governments across the state of Wisconsin, that somehow magically, because a few people are suggesting they might be willing to come to the table now, that we can ensure that every district and every jurisdiction is able to achieve these savings just because a few people are now at the 11th hour claiming they want to negotiate. The bottom line is to ensure what's going to happen in a week when we introduce our budget, and there are going to be reductions of significant size when it comes to aid to local government from the state, just like nearly every other state across the country. But unlike New York and California, for example, they cut billions of dollars in their proposals from their schools, from their university system, and ultimately from their local governments without giving them any tools to balance it off. In this bill, we're giving them the tools to ensure that they don't have to incur massive layoffs and they don't have to cut core programs at the state and school district level. That's what this is all about. To protect our schools, to protect our local governments, we need to give them the tools that they have been asking for, not just for years, but for decades in this Capitol. And once and for all, when this measure passes, that's exactly what they're going to get. Now, one other thing that's interesting, and it seems as more national political figures come into this Capitol, the facts seem to be straying further and further away from the truth, because we've heard some pretty big doozies today. The reality is that we do have a financial crisis in this state. We do even in this current year. The reality is, because of the way the previous governor and legislature budgeted, we have a shortfall when it comes to Medicaid. We have a gap when it comes to the correction system. We have a gap when it comes to the public defender. In addition, we owe nearly $60 million to the state of Minnesota because of a failed payment from the previous governor for tax reciprocity. We have bill collectors waiting for us to collect bills, and it's time we step up and take care of the bills that we owe, and the fact that the bills will be forthcoming even more so in the future. We're going to do what it takes to get this budget on track, and equally, if not of greater importance, we're going to make sure that we're set up come July 1st, when the next biennial budget begins, that we have the tools not only to balance the state budget, but to ensure that all of our local governments have the tools they need to balance their budgets with these very modest proposals to allow all of us, myself included, my cabinet, the legislature, to help make more in terms of pension and premium health care premium contributions. So that's kind of where we're at. I know there's a bunch of questions. We'll take a few before you go on. Sure.
I'm curious why removing the ability to have collective bargaining over benefits closes the budget gap. They keep saying this is about collective bargaining. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, the bottom line is, and again, as a local government official, I can tell you, if you're going to see major cuts in aid to local governments, which is exactly what's going to come and what I've said is going to come for some time, and what nearly every other governor across the country is doing, the only way I can ensure to the public in this state that those cuts aren't going to lead to massive layoffs of teachers, city, county, local government workers, major cuts in core services at the local level, is if those local governments have the authority to set their pension and benefit levels the way we're outlining in this bill. If you have collective bargaining agreements in place, there's no guarantee that any of those savings will be materialized.
But you remove future collective bargaining altogether. You give the government the absolute upper hand over them, don't you?
You ultimately allow local and state government to determine what the pension and health care benefits are in the future. Absolutely. That's what local governments have been asking for years. They don't have that right now. I didn't have that when I was the county executive. That's why time and time again I'd come back to the unions in Milwaukee County and ask for simple changes in terms of pension or health care contributions. I even asked for a while for a 35-hour work week. Their response to me was, we don't want it. You can go do something else. Go lay off 400 or 500 employees. We don't care. The reality is I think the people of the state care, both because it will affect services negatively and because in this environment, in this economy, I don't think many of us, if other than a few of the union leaders, want anybody off at a time.
Governor Scott Walker, defiant, pugilistic, does not look like he is interested in accepting the olive branch that Ed Schultz just described for us. Ed,
hold it right there. The Republicans lie. They want to see you dead. They'd rather make money off your dead corpse.